All right, so utilitarianism. This is going to be the first of our normative ethical theories in moral philosophy. So in essence, what utilitarianism is a hedonistic ethical theory which stipulates the presence of pleasure and the absence of pain as the key indicators of right and wrong. So it's as simple as that. Hedonistic ethical theory, hedonistic meaning focusing on this seeking of pleasure and avoiding pain. That being the key indicator of what is right and wrong. So in essence, what we're saying here is something is bad if it brings about pain, and something is good if it brings about pleasure. Now, this is a moral realist theory. So they believe that there are actual mind-independent moral properties, which is pain and pleasure, which makes a moral statement true or false. So there is a fact to the matter. So utilitarianism is both a descriptive and prescriptive claim. What this means is utilitarianism does, on the one hand, looks out into the world and sees the way the world is from an empirical standpoint. It sees that living creatures seek pleasure and avoid pain, or that pleasure is good for them and pain is bad for them. That's the description of the way the world actually is. And then it's prescriptive in that it suggests that therefore we ought to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, given that is the two things that makes a moral statement true or false. So that's where this normative, prescriptive claim comes from. So to start with, Jeremy Bentham was our key proponent of utilitarianism. He first wrote about utilitarianism, and we call Bentham's utilitarianism ACT utilitarianism. And in short, what ACT utilitarianism is it is the greatest happiness for the greatest number that is the measure of right and wrong. So greatest happiness for the greatest number, meaning what brings about the most pleasure for the most amount of people. Now, Bentham taught in some length about utilitarianism, and in that he talked about his utility calculus. Now, what the utility calculus is 7 antecedents, so 7 things that we could look at, which would then produce what we would say is the optimal outcome in terms of maximizing pleasure. So according to Bentham, we should look to these things to see how effective an action is in what outcome it's going to bring about. So how much it utilizes the principle. So in terms of each individual part, so we've got purity, which is will that act bring about just pleasure, or will it also bring about pain? How pure is the outcome? Is it just a pleasurable outcome, or is it painful as well? Propinquity is how immediate will it be? Will that pleasure be there straight away, or will it take some time for us to get the desired effect? Fecundity is, will it produce more pleasures? So will it ripple? Will there be a ripple effect? Will it replicate? Intensity is how much pleasure there'll be. This could also be for pain as well. We could take this both ways, but intensity, how much pleasure? How good will that pleasure be? Certainty is, do we know that we're definitely there's going to be a pleasurable outcome or a happy outcome? Extent is for how many people will that pleasure be for? And duration is how long it lasts. So that was sort of the first idea of how we actually measure utilitarianism from a somewhat scientific standpoint, as Jeremy Bentham was a scientist. One issue, though, that we have initially with the utility calculus is it's kind of impractical, or some would say this is impractical. How do we really go about measuring any of these things? How certain can we be that any action is going to bring about these desired outcomes, given that we live in such an indeterminate world, an uncertain world? We're not very good at really predicting, especially when it comes to human affairs, what the outcomes will be. So you might argue then that this is an impractical calculus, it's useless. Or you might argue that it's not in some other way. So some further issues then, just with act utilitarianism in general. The first one is known as the tyranny of the majority. Now this is a general issue. So the tyranny of the majority is this problem that with utilitarianism we have this idea of maximizing the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, for the greatest amount of people. Now, let's say that for whatever reason, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number will mean for a very small minority of people that there will be some great pain for those people. But it still maximizes this great pleasure for lots and lots and lots of people. It's just at the expense of this one person or this minority of people. Now that can be a problem for some, because some people would find that a hard pill to swallow. Some would find that something that's just not acceptable. We just cannot accept that for some people this might mean some great pain, a great problem for them. So that's the problem of the tyranny of the majority. The second is the doctrine of the swine. So some people dub utilitarianism as the doctrine of the swine, i.e. the doctrine of just debauchery, just pleasures from any direction. It doesn't really give us a sophisticated account of what this is. For all we know, all these pleasures might just be things that aren't really what we'd consider virtue, particularly in the traditional view of what virtues are, like temperance and those kinds of things. If we're just seeking pleasures, is that actually good? Are we actually good people from just doing that? It seems like historically, when you look at pleasure seekers or people that are hedonists, we might not call them the most virtuous of people. It's decadence. Some people think that that's not really moral. So then we get on to Mill's. So John Stuart Mill, he made a revision of Bentham's theory. He was one of Bentham's students. He learned a lot from Bentham. And John Stuart Mill had a slightly different idea. He thought we could demarcate between lower pleasures and higher pleasures, where lower pleasures were this kind of doctrine of the swine, or this debauchery, just greed, just taking as much as you can in a lower sense, just sensational pleasures, bodily satisfactions, the pleasures of the swine, as John Stuart Mill says. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. And what he means by this is it's better to live a life of higher pleasures, not just these lower pleasures of sensational things like just eating lots of nice food and drinking nice drinks and those kinds of things. Higher pleasures for Mill were things like intellectual pleasures, the appreciation of the arts, or deep contemplation, which might bring about a real sense of appreciation for the world, maybe something like that. He thought these were the sorts of pleasures that we should see as higher pleasures, higher virtues. So we call John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism rule utilitarianism because for John Stuart Mill, it's interpreted that at least we should follow some rules. There should be some kind of base level of rules, which still aim to maximize the greatest happiness for the greatest number, but at least give us some kind of base, some kind of moral base, in which to make it so that there's not these problems like the tyranny of the majority. That there couldn't be a situation where, for a minority of people, or in some situations, there is some sort of disastrous outcome in some way. We try to protect against that by having some ground rules. So this is what we call the difference between Bentham's quantitative hedonism and John Stuart Mill's qualitative hedonism, where we might interpret Bentham's as this idea of just maximizing any sort of pleasure that will bring us any sort of happiness as we see it. Whereas John Stuart Mill is this idea of, well, maybe we should focus on these higher pleasures as the crux of what it means to maximize happiness. So John Stuart Mill had some proofs. Now, he went through this process to try and show or try and prove that utilitarianism was the right sort of moral theory, ethical theory. And he takes 3 key steps. The first one is he proves that happiness is good for each person. He does this by simply stating that happiness is something that we all seem to want. There isn't, according to John Stuart Mill, there isn't really a case where any human wouldn't want happiness. Every human wants happiness. Every individual wants to be happy. And then he takes a step from that to state that, well, general happiness then must also be a good for all. Because if each individual wants to be happy, then surely the general happiness is what we should all have, what we should all seek. And then the third step is just to make it clear that happiness is the only good we seek. It is our telos, our chief good, the end of what we do. There is no means to anything else where it comes to happiness. Happiness is the end. And from this is why you get this quite simplistic theory of utilitarianism, because we don't need to posit anything else other than happiness, because happiness is the telos. We can make it a general rule as a prescription for society, and we can do that on the basis that we all seek happiness. So there we go. Happiness, great for all. And pain is bad for all, on the antithesis of that. So a few issues then. The first issue, which comes from G.E. Moore, is the naturalistic fallacy. We've seen this in the metaethics video. So the naturalistic fallacy is an argument against John Stuart Mill's proof. And in essence, what the naturalistic fallacy is saying is that just because we can look out into the world and see that each individual seeks happiness or seeks pleasure and wishes to avoid pain and sees pain as a bad thing, does not mean then that we ought to prescribe that as a moral rule. So for Moore, this is very much linked to Hume's is-ought gap, which is to say that no amount of descriptive claims about the world, no amount of facts about the world will ever prove a normative claim, i.e. a moral claim, a moral judgment. Because a moral judgment, according to Hume, just simply comes from our motivations, our desires. And that is ultimately what Moore's getting at. Linked to that is Moore's open question argument, which is that whole idea there's like, good cannot really be defined. We can't really define good. We might say it's something like happiness, but then trying to define that would be problematic, because there's always that problem of asking, well, why would that thing be happy, or why is that thing pleasurable? And is not everyone's idea of happiness slightly different? So we've got those issues to contend with in utilitarianism. The second is known as the fallacy of composition. Now, this is a fallacy that comes up a lot in our moral theories and also in arguments for God as well, the fallacy of composition. In brief form, what the fallacy of composition is the idea that just because each individual part has the property X doesn't mean the whole also has the property X. So it's basically to say that just because each individual wants happiness doesn't mean the collective should want happiness. Or just because what's true of each individual does not mean it's true of the collective. Because if you recall, what John Stuart Mill was doing was going from the step of each individual seeks happiness to saying that therefore the general happiness is what we should seek as well. There's no reason to say that that ought to be the case, or that each individual's happiness entails the collective happiness. It may be the case that, of course, the general happiness is good, but it's not necessarily good just on the basis of the parts. Okay, just on the basis of what's true of the parts doesn't necessarily entail, doesn't necessarily mean that it's also true of the collective. Here's another example. So what's true, say, of the parts of my body isn't necessarily true of me as a being. So what's true of my stomach and what that does, and what's true of my other organs and what they do, doesn't necessarily entail what's true of my being together. Because my being together may be, as a whole, there's something else about that that's true, which can't be explained just in terms of its parts. Something like that. So some further issues with rule utilitarianism, which is John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism, is it's too strong. Some people would say it's actually too strong to have these ground rules, these base rules that can't be broken. So here's an example. Say some mad axeman's knocking at your door, and they say, well, you've got an axe, they look kind of angry, like they're probably going to cause some damage. Knock on the door and they say, where's your mother? And of course, you're not going to want to tell them where your mother is. You're not going to want to tell them the truth. But one of the ground rules might be never to lie. But another ground rule as well might be to maximise happiness, just to make sure that your mother survives, and all those things, because that is maximising happiness. So at that point, you're going to have to break the rule, and you're going to have to lie to the axeman. Because situationally, you're thinking to yourself, well, I need to break this rule for this greater outcome. So therefore, with rule utilitarianism, and this is true of life, there isn't really going to be an absolute law, an absolute rule that can never be broken, because there's always going to be situations in which you may need to break that rule, particularly for a better outcome, for the greater good, the greater consequences. And in which case, if there isn't actually an absolute rule, a strict rule, then we may as well just refer back to act utilitarianism. It doesn't become any different to act utilitarianism. It just becomes something like act utilitarianism with some guidelines, and that's what those rules are. So that's an issue that we've got to contend with there, with rule utilitarianism. So some more general issues then, just issues with utilitarianism in general is Nozick's pleasure machine. So this was a thought experiment by Nozick, Robert Nozick, and the idea here was, imagine you could plug yourself in to a machine. Now in this machine, you can do whatever you like, virtual reality, okay? And you can have as many pleasures at any one time and as intense as you like, all day, every day, as much as you like. It's the unlimited pleasure machine. Now for Nozick, the idea there is that in this machine, where we could have all the pleasure in the world, we never have to have any pain, okay? He thought that there's probably going to be two things. One is, or at least we can interpret that there's probably going to be two outcomes. One is those pleasures will start to have diminishing returns. The effects will start to be diminished because we're having so many of them that we're losing this contrast of pain. So how good will those pleasures continue to be? That's number one. And number two is we would probably at some point want to have authentic experiences. If all our experiences are just experiences of pleasure, eventually we're going to get to a point where, well, we just want to actually have something authentic. For example, we're never going to want someone to be truthful or honest with us if it's going to cause us pain. So we just have to live a world of a lie, for example. And in this world of the lie, this world of deception, just for the good of pleasure, Nozick thinks isn't going to be something ultimately we would want. We'd rather have some pain in our world, at least if it's authentic. Think about how much emphasis we put on knowing the truth, even if it is painful. Think about situations in your life where you'd have wanted to know the truth, even if it did cause pain. So that's going to be an issue for utilitarianism, because they're going to have to contend with that idea. Second is, if you want to think about Foot's trolley problem, Philip Foot's trolley problem, you can kill 5 or kill 1. Well, of course, the best outcome is if there's a tram going down a track, right, and you're at the levers, and you know it's going to kill 5 people, and there's nothing you can do, apart from one thing. You could switch the point, and it would kill 1 person. So it's definitely going to kill 5. Or, if you intervene, switch the track, it'll kill one person. Now, many people might think, yeah, well, switch the track, utilitarian outcome. But what if the means of doing that change? What if it means, as the thought experiment goes, pushing some very large person off of a bridge to do the same thing? Now, we might think the act of doing that, really killing someone, isn't morally good, even if it does bring about a better outcome. Just the very act itself, the nature of the act becomes immoral, not just the outcome. So again, utilitarianism has to contend with that. Is it just about the outcome, or is sometimes the nature of the act? There's something wrong there. So last we get to Peter Singer. Now Peter Singer was huge on animal rights and thought that utilitarianism should be a part of animal rights as well. You know, animals suffer pain and all those and experience pleasure, and you know we should think about them in our moral theories as well. But preference utilitarianism also comes out of Singer. And that is, we should aim to maximise the greatest sum of preferences. So this being the key. It's not just about pleasure and pain. It's more about people's preference. Sort of like democracy, I guess. That seems to be how, in some ways, democracy should work. Maximising people's preferences. And this might be a bit of a better basis to work from, instead of just about happiness or pleasure. But again, even with changing it to preference utilitarianism, we still have problems like tyranny of the majority. And we also have conflicting interests. Think about how that works in democracy. When we're trying to decide, we have all these conflicting interests where some groups' interests might be the absolute opposite of, or the contradiction of another group's interests. Now, do we just go with whose interests come out on top? Do we just go with the most sum of interests, whether it is contrasting to some other group's interests? That's a problem here, which leads on to the problem of partiality. And that's the idea that ultimately when it comes to preferences, even pleasure and pain, when we're making those decisions, we naturally by nature act partially. We act partially towards our loved ones and our friends and the people around us and the people we think we're alike. That seems to be human nature. So how do we tackle the problem of partiality? How do we make it so that our decisions are really impartial? Because it's just not something we seem to do in the situation. If someone's dog went into the river and was drowning and there was some stranger, I'm pretty sure most people would go and fetch their dog first. Now, I'm not saying that there's any which way to go, really. It's not really a right answer, but there is a problem of partiality at least going on, which utilitarianism would have to give us some sort of framework in order to tackle. So that is utilitarianism in a nutshell, according to this specification.